We're going to be looking at modals and SideMenu, the sidebars within Google Apps Script. So adding those to the UI menu. So we've got the modal, which grays out and doesn't allow us to interact with the spreadsheet content. We've got the Modal Less option, which allows us to interact with the spreadsheet content and click through that content. And we've also got a sidebar. So that's going to give us an option to have a sidebar here on the right-hand side. Within the content that we're outputting, so we're outputting content from a page, so we can also introduce interaction from the client side to the server side, so allowing us to have a close button, which will close the sidebar. We can also close the modals with the close button. And this is all within the client side code, where we're running the Google Script host close function whenever the button gets clicked. And this is all JavaScript code. We're using the query selector and then the event listener to add to the button. We can also introduce interaction from the client side to the server side, where we can run a script on the server side. So this is going to be an example of the server side, client side interaction. So we've got an adder. So every time it gets clicked, it's going to add to the clicked value. And this is just running still on the client side, updating the HTML using the document object. We also have an option to invoke functions on the server side. So what happened when we clicked button number 2, we ran a script on the server side called run1, and that script took the value that was passed in to it and created a UI alert with a message that says clicked and the value of the clicked, which at this point was 10. And then we also have an option to make a request and return back server-side content back to the client side and then use that within the client side. So we've got that example within data, where it's actually getting the real-time data from the spreadsheet and outputting it onto the page. So if the spreadsheet data changes, then the data that's being output of the page will also change. So we've got a request from loader that's running a function on the server side called getData. And then once it successfully retrieves back content, it's going to run a function success on the server side. And the data object here is going to be what's responded back from the server side. And then we're just using it within the client side to build a simple table. And on the server side, we're requesting the spreadsheet values within an array and returning that array object back to the client side to be used to output the page sheet content onto the page. Open up your Google spreadsheet and then under extensions, hit the app script. That's going to open up the editor for the app script. And this is a bound script. I already do have some function here, and the one function that I do have is the onOpen, and this is a trigger that's going to run every time the spreadsheet opens. And what it's doing is adding to the menu here. So we've got the ADV button with a couple options that we've done before with the alert and the prompt. So we're going to be adding to this menu, having more options and running some different functions, one to show a modal and then also to show the sidebar. So right now, let's go and open up the script where we've got the function onOpen, and we're going to add items to the menu. So add item, and the first item that we're going to add is going to be the modal, and we'll have that run under function 3. So this is also expecting a string value, and we'll call it show3. And then between those, I'm going to add in a separator, and we'll save that. Let's run the onOpen, so that will update our menu. So we've got a separator to the alert and the prompt, which we've done earlier, and we've got the modal function there that's going to run and get executed once we make that selection of the button. So let's create the show3 function. And within here, this is where we want to, first we want to select and create the content for the output, and doing this as a separate HTML page. So we can select that HTML page. So within the files, let's create a new HTML page. And this can just be called show3 and save that. And it can open this up within the editor as well. And this is just a typical HTML page. So whatever we want to write in there. So for now, we'll write hello world, and then we'll update some of the content within that pop-up. So now that we've created that page that we can use, we need to select it into a usable object. So we're going to use the HTML service and then use the create output from file. And that's going to generate that content as usable output. And here we're going to be expecting a string value that's going to match the file name. So that's going to be just show3. And within the logger log, if you want to see what you've got for the contents of the HTML object, you can run the function separately. And it's created as HTML output. So we can use this HTML output that we can have within the side menu. And for this, we can use the Spreadsheet app, get the UI of the Spreadsheet app object, and then select the method that we want to run. I'm going to indent it slightly. So we've got a couple options for the modal. We can do a dialog and a Modal Less dialog. And I'll show what the difference between the two is. So they're both expecting the same arguments. So one is going to be the HTML object, and then the other one is the title that we want to use for the, and this is expecting a string value. So we'll call it my modal. And then we can end that statement. So let's select under advanced modal, and we are going to need authorization to run the script. So this is the authorization pop-up. And you can just run through here. It's just that Google hasn't verified that because obviously we just created it, and the app is going to be running under this account. So that's my Google account that I'm using to create the application. And once we've read through this and we're okay with it, you can click at the bottom. So it's going to have the file name. So in this case, we're called test UI menu script. So go to that. It's going to provide you the permissions that the script is going to be using. You can always remove the permissions by clicking the Google account. And that's going to bring you to the myaccount.google/permissions. And this is going to be where you can have all of your apps that you've provided permissions for to that account within your Google account, and you can remove them from there. So once you've okay with adding the permissions, you can successfully add the permissions, and now we should be able to run the modal, which is going to output that HTML code. So we've got the my modal HTML code, and that's what we're going to have for the pop-up. So try the other Modal Less, and this is going to be, I guess, Modal Less, and we'll just run it under show3. So copy the code that we have here, and we'll use the same HTML object. And instead of the show modal dialog, we want to use the show modal less dialog. So again, expecting the HTML object, modal less, and we can remove out that second line of code. And what I'll do is I'll indent this with the tab. So save that, and we need to run the on open again to add the object to the menu. So once that script runs, now we can look, and we should have a second option for Modal Less. You can take, and when you select the modal, this is the one that's going to gray out the content around it. You can't click the cells anymore, and you only have the option to close it. But again, going into the Modal Less, we can still interact with the cells that are behind the modal. So that's the difference between the Modal Less and the modal, is that we can interact with the spreadsheet content in the Modal Less model. So closing that, and show you another one that we can do, and that's the sidebar. So that will be another item that we're going to add, and we'll just call this one sidebar or side menu. And I'll call it side menu, and this one is going to be under show 5. And save that, and I'll run the code on open to add it to the drop-down menu in the spreadsheet. And let's select that and select number 5. For this one as well, we're going to create the output from the same file. So calling the file show3. So even though we're on show 4 and 5, we'll just keep the show 3, and then we can create separate files if we want for these. So within the option for the sidebar, the content is going to be the same, and it's going to be expecting show sidebar, and then whatever the HTML object that we want within the sidebar. And for this one, we can set a title within the HTML object. So if we want a specific title, we can add that in there. And I'll just call it Hello World as our title within the HTML object. Let's go into the spreadsheet and click the sidebar. We need to apply and allow the authorization of the script again. So I'm going to go through this quickly, just apply and allow the script to run under my account. And I'll try the sidebar one more time. So that pops up the sidebar. There's the title there of the sidebar that we set. And the sidebar is always going to be on the right-hand side there, showing up. So let's add another option here within the add menu. And we'll just call it Popup. And number 6. So this is going to be, once again, we'll copy most of what we've done in the other functions. We don't need to log it out. And then within the UI option, we can just show the dialog. And the art property within the dialog, let's just show the HTML object. The show dialog is actually a deprecated method, so I'm just illustrating that it is still available, but you should be using the show dialog and the show Modal Less dialog instead. Now, even though the show dialog method is still there, and it's going to show up the same as the Modal Less dialog. So the preferred way is to use the show Modal Less dialog and not use the show dialog. But this is just an illustration that. So let's do the pop-up, which is going to be the dialog that you can still type on the spreadsheet. And then if we do the Modal Less, it's going to pop up the same thing, where we've got the Modal Less there and showing the content. So with these pop-ups as well, you have options to set some parameters. So you can set the different height and width of the pop-ups. So let's update some of those. And these are both properties that you can set for all of the dialogues. And this is actually going to be set on the HTML object. So selecting that HTML object, we can set a title. We can also set a height and a width. So let's set the height, and this is going to expect a numeric value. So whatever we want the height, and let's set it at 400 pixels. Also select the HTML object. We can set the width for this. If we want a wide modal, we can set it to 800 pixels. For the HTML object, we can also set the content. So this is where it's expecting content, and this is a string value. And this can be HTML code. So adding in content to the already HTML content within the file. Let's try number 4, and that's within the modal. And let's try the Modal Less. So that's our number 4 there. So it actually updated the content with the new content that we've added. So you can set up the HTML object and then just using the HTML service, and you can set the content that way as well, and that's going to override the file input. You can also create HTML output content, so we don't have to grab it necessarily from a file. This can come already as HTML code. So that's another option that you have. And I'm going to comment out the set content, as we're going to be using the Modal Less, and we're generating the HTML content there. So it's creating HTML output. You can also set the title here within the arguments, so you don't have to set it separately, or you can set it separately if you want as well. There's a couple ways to set the title. And the same thing for the Modal Less. You can apply all of these properties for the modal or for Modal Less dialogues. So for all of the dialogues, you have the same options. Deprecated method, so it's not used anymore. So within the HTML file, you can also run code. So you can use the Google script host value. So if we had a button and close, so this button element, you can add JavaScript code since this is all front-end code. So adding in the script tag. And then within the JavaScript, using the document query selector, selecting the button element. And then for the button, this is just regular JavaScript. We're going to add the event listener, and the event that we're listening for is going to be a click. So whenever it gets clicked, then it's going to invoke this function. So just create an anonymous function that's going to run the Google script host. And what we want to do is we want to run the Google script host close. So try that out, and we'll just close. So try that out within the modal. And now when we click the close button, it's going to close the pop-up. And so we have an option here that we can interact with the page content. Let's create another HTML page. And I'll just call this one loader, as this one is going to do a little bit more, where it's going to create a button just as we've got here, but this button is going to load some of the data from the spreadsheet, and it'll output it into the area here. So selecting and adding in some more front-end code. So setting up an element with a class of output. So we've got an area on the screen that we can output some content to. And then within the JavaScript, select the element using the query selector, selecting the element with a class of output so that we can have it within our code as an object. So in this loader function, we've got the option here to output some content into that area. So once it gets clicked, output, and we'll set the text content, and I'll just call it clicked. And we can also have a value for counter and set that to be 0. So every time it gets clicked, that will increment. And this is going to be running the front end code. And I'll use the template literals. So those are the backticks that we can add in the counter value within the string output of the output area. So let's update the code where we can have a separate function. And I'll just call this one show7. And the result of this one will be showing the Modal Less dialog as well. Except in this case, we'll have some added functionality, and we're not going to load the show, and we're also going to be getting this from a file. So let's update that, and the file that we're getting is going to be called loader. So this will give us a way to interact with the content, and basically this is the client side to server side communication. And let's add in an item into the menu, and this will be client side to server side and using show7. Save that, add it to the menu with the on open, and now let's see what we get there loading. So right now we get the JavaScript, the interaction, where it's updating the clicks when we're pressing close. And maybe that shouldn't say close, it should just say adder. So it'll add to the click value. You can also get content as well. So let's create a second button. And this one will give a classes there so that we can identify these. So this can be button 1 with a class of button 1. And the second one, again, this is going to be using JavaScript client side to the server side. So this one will return back some data, and we'll add in one more button here. We'll have one for data, so that can be button 3. And then this one will invoke a function. So button 2 will invoke a function. Let's select those elements from the page. So that can be button 1 and have it as button 1. And then button 2 and button 3. So all of these are added to the client-side code. And save that. So now we should have the ability to do interactions on all of those page elements. Let's add the event listeners to the other button objects and test it out just to make sure that it's working. So now we should have the 3 buttons. We've got the adder, the invoke, and the data. So what invoke will do is, instead of updating the counter, this will run a script on the Google side. So using the Google script, and run, and then whatever the name of the script is that we want to run. So let's create a function, and I'll call it run1. And so within this function, what we'll do is we'll pop up an alert to the user. So getting the spreadsheet app, and then we'll just have a message here to the user. And we can pass in a value here. So what the message will be, clicked, and this will run the alert. So go back to the loader, and we're going to run, and the function that we're going to run is run1. So with the parentheses in order to invoke it and run it. So let's try that again, open it up, and hit invoke. And now what we're doing is we're actually running that function. So that's where we get the clicked value popping up there. So that way we can run code on the server side. And as well, we can pass in that value. And then from the loader, let's pass in whatever the value of counter is at the time. So try that again. And let's set a value for counter. Hit the invoked. There's our value for 6 that's been passed in from the client side to the server side. So it allows us to invoke. We're also able to run on success. So once we get a successful callback, we can do something with the code. So we'll add that to the third button. And this one is going to use the Google script run. And we're going to be running with successful or success handler, and then the function that we want to run if we're successful. And we'll just run a function called success. So this is on the client side. And then on the server side, we'll run the function get data. And then here we can have success. And whatever we've got the response back, so we're going to be returning back data. And that data object we can then output as the inner HTML, whatever we get back for data. So let's try that now. We're on the server side. We're going to run a function called get data. And then that's going to return back some HTML. And let's construct that HTML. So on the server side, and save that. So try that one, and data. So that's returning back from the client side to the server side, returning back that HTML code that we've got on the server side. So you can also get content. So if we want to get a spreadsheet data, let's populate some content into the spreadsheet. So we can close that. And I'm going to just add in some content into the spreadsheet. So just some random content here. So we have something that we can return back to the user. And within the app script, let's select the spreadsheet app, get active sheet. We want to get data range, and then get the values from that data range. And we can just output this as data. Let's make sure first that we're able to get content from the spreadsheet. So we'll run the function get data. So that returns back the array with all the content. And now let's return back that data string value. So we go over to here and we hit data. That's going to return back all of the contents of the data object. So going back into the client side, we can do data and then for each, looping through each row of content. And then for the row, we can do for each, and this will loop through each cell of content. So let's create some HTML that we can output. So HTML. So we'll start by opening up the table and then taking the HTML and adding to the HTML. So adding to the table row. And then for the table cells, we can add in the contents of that cell. So again, using the template literals, and close that off. And then for the rows, we're going to close off the row. And then lastly, we're going to close off the table. and then output the HTML to the page. So close the table and then output the HTML. So that should reconstruct the contents that we have within the spreadsheet and allow us to output it within this page. So hit data, and that outputs our content from the spreadsheet on the page. And of course, we can apply some styling because this is just regular front-end code. So if we want for the table as well as for the table cells, set up a border and then the color of the border that we want to add in. So just try that one more time. Update the output of data. So that should pull in real time the content that we have from the spreadsheet. If we update that content, it's going to make another request to the server side and then return back that updated content onto the page. So that's how you can create the client server interactions within the Google Apps script. So go ahead and try it out for yourself to get more familiar with what you can do within the menu, within the modals, and then loading in files and then communicating from the client side to the server side and generating output within the modals or the sidebars.